In this round of building the Catcher game, we're going to add images. This will allow us to have more flexibility with the artwork that we put into our project. So to do that, we have to then make the images that go with our project. So now I'm just going to update that. This will be our Catcher with images. Couple things we need to think about. What are the actual pixel dimensions that we are working with? So the current game is set up at 800 by 600, so if we maintain that, that's how big we should bring in background artwork. The Catcher object, we can look at that and we can see that is currently set at 32 pixels. Our drops are coming in at a whopping 16 pixels in size. So if we want to work with images, those are going to be pretty small. So we might end up wanting to make our images a little bit bigger, but we also may want to keep that. If we start getting into these 16 or even 32 pixel sized images, we may want to think about using pixel art, which there are a number of good resources that we can find pixel art that we can work with online. One resource that is available is OpenGameArt. On OpenGameArt, there are lots of assets that you can download. So you can go, in this case, we'll be looking at probably 2D artwork because you're looking for things that you can use. So we'll see we have a lot of tile maps and sprites and things like that. So you can start to narrow down your search and look through the artwork collections there. Another resource is Kenny. And again, both of these are open source now. You can donate to them or you can buy their or support them through Patreon. So we do have some different options available. So if we look here, we'll see we have a lot of different kinds of things that you can work with, both 2D, 3D artwork. So you can buy where you would buy all of the assets that are in a given collection. And part of the advantage of doing that is you are now supporting the creators of these. So if I wanted cartoon characters, I could go grab that. So if I look here, it gives me some artwork, I can play with it. So if I don't have the time, skill, or motivation to make my own artwork, I could certainly use places like Kenny or OpenGameArt as ways to obtain image assets. Now I'm going to just show, we'll be looking at the code here, but this is the code that in the reference for processing for adding an image into our project. So we'll come back to the code in a little bit, but first we're going to jump into Photoshop and just do some real basic work. So here I have an image that I want to work with on it. So this image was a public domain image that I'm working with. Now, if I look at the size of this image, you'll see that this image is 360 by 200 pixels tall. That's big. That's a lot when our current drops, as we look at the drops happening within our game, were instead 16. So if I were to shrink it down, it would be pretty considerable. So we will be shrinking it down. But first I need to remove it from its background because it has all of this background on here and I don't want to be working with that. So the first step, noticing that in Photoshop, this image shows up as a background layer because it's a flat image. It's not a transparent image. And there's a number of ways we can get rid of that. The easiest is we double click on it and it will convert it from a background layer to a standard layer, which allows for transparency. And now I have used the object select tool to select the shape, and I will simply then take my selection and inverse it. So now it chooses the area around it. And if I hit delete, we see it gets rid of all that space around it. Now, this is a good first step. I've cleaned that up. I have extra space on the sides here. Now, whenever we're bringing images into processing to work with, it doesn't care if the image is transparent or if there's color in those pixels. It still needs to allocate or reserve memory for each pixel in an image. So our goal is to get our images as small as possible so that we don't have extra wasted pixels happening. So now I can try and pull down and shrink this up a little bit. Let's turn on snap. Oh, grabbed the wrong. So now snap gives me kind of a little feeling when it's getting to the edge of the pixels. Okay, so now I've gone as tight as I can while maintaining it, and then I can click the check mark or hit the return key to accept that transformation. Now if we look at this, let's see how big the image is. And the image is 200 by 200. Well, that's a pretty big difference from 16 to 200. So if we shrink it down, so if we say I go down once, so we were right here at 400%, but if we bring it down to 100%, so there is how big the image is. Now if I bring this in 200 pixels by 200 pixels and we jump it into our processing project, and this is 800 pixels across, that means each one would be 1/4 the size of my project. So clearly that's not going to be an acceptable size if I want to use this in my project. So I need to shrink it down. So if I go to 100, if I go to 50, if we go to 25, so we can see here it is, shrunk down a little bit. If I go and choose under image size, we can shrink it down a little bit more. So even if I shrink it down to 50, and we can start to see how it's going to look when it is shrunk down to 50. And to maintain transparency when we save it, what we can do is we can export it, and export as, or even quick export as a PNG is going to maintain that. And I'm going to then go into my project. Now I've made a folder to hold all of my images that I will be using, and I call it a data folder, capital D data. So it's important that we have a folder for our assets that we're going to be using in our project. And I will just put COVID there, so I'm saving it out as a PNG, and now it saves it. If I go to this file right here, this is a nice landscape image that I have going. With this, I'm going to do a quick export. Now this has been sized to 800 by 600, so it's the size I need it. And I'm going to just choose an easier to use name. We'll just call this background. I'm going to save that out. And I now have another image here. So this is another one that I want to use on my project, and I can make it transparent. But again, it hasn't been cropped to the smallest possible dimensions yet. So with that, I do want to crop it down and get as tight as I can with it. So I'm creating two objects that are going to fall, because as we extend out our game, we're going to add in objects that we want to catch and objects we want to avoid. Now you may be noticing there it's kind of a little bit of a theme going on here. It looks like we could be a couple pixels tighter, but we're going to let that go for now. So now this image, let's see how big this one is. This image here is considerably too big, because if I make this image my drop that is falling that I want to catch, and the COVID spore is the one I want to avoid, our current drops were 16. So if I even just put this at 32, we can see, wow, that's getting really small. Maybe we'll start out at 64 and try that as a size. We'll try a version at 32. Let's see how this works. So it's 32 wide, 22 tall. And now let's do a quick export as PNG. We'll throw that into the data folder. And just going to undo that size so I can decide if I want to do more. Now I have this face that we've played with in some other activities at different times. I want to shrink this down. Now going back into here, if I look at the catcher was 32. Probably going to make it a little bigger this time, again, just so we can see what's going on. So we shrink it down to 64. It's 100 by 64. The width is really what I care about for the catching, so I'm going to let that slide for now. So we'll shrink it down and then export this out as a PNG. Put it into the data folder. All right, so now we have images in our data folder. And if I go look here, we can see, let's see, load image. So we need to load that image, and then we need to display that image in our draw function. When we load it, we have a variable. It's a p-image variable. So it's processing image is what we're working with. Then we populate that using load image, and then we use the load image command specifying where we want to draw that on the screen. So now's the time to put that into action. To add our image, what we need to do is we need to create a variable to store a reference to it. And we'll just reference the background with BK. So we're going to start out, we'll just get one image working, then after that we'll see how we can add in more. The key thing about working with images is we only load them once, but then we can say we want to show that image wherever we need to show it later on in our different draw function. Well, not different, we have one draw function, but then it may be referencing other functions that are saying what image to display. So all of our loading should only happen inside setup. And this is important because if you put your load images inside the draw, that means 60 times per second you're loading a new copy of that image. And what's going to happen is you will run out of memory and your program will crash over time if it runs long enough. So now I can say bk equals load image. And now I just specify the path to it, which is data/background.png. So that now loads in a background image. To display that image, I'm going to go into my game function. And I mean, we kind of almost don't need clear background here because I'm going to be drawing this image over the top. We'll just leave that there for now. We'll decide later if we want to change anything. I use the image command, specify what image I want to show and where I want to show it. Now, the thing about loading images are registered by their top left corner. So this background image is the same size as our program, 800 by 600, and we want our top left corner to appear in the top left corner of the program, which is 0, 0. So one thing that's going to happen is our collision detection, because it's based on circles, we may have to do some adjustments to either the collision detection or how we display our artwork on screen. And we'll see how that plays out in a little bit. But right now, let's see if the image works. Hit the button, click, and there it is. And, you know, I think that's nice. It gives a different visual moving over a textured background. So, and I lucked out that it's dark up in the top left corner, so where the score text is showing up, we can read it. And that's something you have to be careful about. When you put images in the background and you put text over the top, can we see that or read that? So now I'm going to add a few more images in. So we have our catcher image and our drop image. So again, when we have multiple variables of the same type, we can put them on one line, separating them with commas. But then when we populate them, of course, we have to use multiple lines. So we have to make sure that our file names match. So if I look in my data folder, I see background, COVID, face, medkit. Oh, so it wouldn't have worked when I said catcher. I was trying to remember, and that's why it's always good to check. So if I did have it wrong, I'll show what happens. We generally will see an error message down there, and things won't show up on screen quite right. So it's important to get it correct. So it's good I checked the images that I was loading. So let's bop over into the catcher here, and I can just simply say image. And now the image, if I go with this, catcher image, and now we don't want to draw this image at 0, 0. We want to draw it at X and Y. So now it's corresponding to that location. So let's run this again and see. Now we can see where that registers. So my cursor kind of sits in the top left corner of the rectangle that represents the image. So we're going to have to do some changes or adjustments to move it over. It also looks like I could probably shrink the size of it down, but we'll leave it like that because it's always nice to have a big head. So to adjust that, I need to change and offset that. If I go into this image and reference the image again, we can see, so it's 64 by 103. So if I want it centered on where that cursor is, we need to go left 32 and up about 52. 51, 52. So X minus 32, Y minus 52. And now let's run this and see what happens. Now we can see how it's centered, but notice the area that is affected. And I'm going to just change this fill to make it transparent. So when we are showing this image, it's not putting it quite where we want it to be. And we do have now two options as we put this in. Because if I go and look at this, we have the ability to display the image, but we can also resize it when we put it in. Ideally, we don't want to do that because then we're loading and scaling pixels. In our small project, it's not a big deal, but in bigger projects, it could be a big deal. So even if I were to shrink this in half and say, let's draw it at, instead of 64, it's 32 and 52. And then we cut these numbers in half as well. So we only go over 16 and I only go over 26. Again, so we're halving all of those values. Now let's see how this looks. So when we run it, we'll see it's much closer to the size of, it's kind of fun that the circles fall into the hair and it's only when they hit the face, but then the chin wouldn't be an active area because we can see where that corresponds to where the player is. And I also may want to control the cursor on here. So we could make the cursor disappear when we are playing the game, but we bring it back in our different states. So I'm going to do that just because it will allow us to see what's happening with the face a little bit more. And I have another idea on something I want to do with the face in a moment as well. But first we'll take care of the cursor. And when we look at it, we can make the cursor go away during a given state with the no cursor command. So if we run this, cursor's here, I click, and now the cursor's gone. Let me catch a few drops. But now if I don't bring the cursor back, that's problematic. So what I could do is pull back the cursor in my other states. We never go back to the title state, so it's not a big deal if we don't do that. Now, we should probably put this inside each one of those methods, but I'm just keeping it here because it makes it a little bit easier just to see what we're doing, because then we're not going through so many lines and lines and lines of code as part of it. So we have the cursor, goes away, catch a couple drops, cursor's back so I can click on my button. So, yep, we're in good shape there. So, nice. I'm gonna just go over here into the face. And if I look at the face, what I want to do with this face is if I command click on its thumbnail, it selects it. And let me choose, I'm gonna just choose a color that's gonna hopefully show and stand out. And now if we go and choose stroke, if I choose to stroke this, oh, center it, so we do 1 pixel in and 1 pixel out. It puts that around the image. All right. So then that works okay. And let me just verify this is still the correct size before I do a save as. Okay, quick export, yep. So now if we do quick export as PNG, goes into the data, puts the face there, save that, we'll replace it. Jump into processing. Now let's run this and see the difference that makes on the image. So we can see how that allows me to see it a little bit better, and I'm using a color that kind of fits. Now if I chose a contrasting color like green or yellow, then it would have a different kind of pop, but I like how that works. So I'm not going to get rid of the circle that we're drawing on top of it just yet, because we will want to understand when we're doing our collision how that comes into play. So this method we're going to leave right now using our circle-based collision. Down the road we'll look at how we can use rectangle-based collision detection, which when we get more non-round objects, that's really going to become more important. Now if I go into the drop, and you can see here are the drops, and I'm going to modify the drops so they were red, but instead of making them red, we will fade them out a little bit so we can see what that circle is. Oh, that's under, well, we want that under reset as well, but under display, let's modify that color here as well. Okay. So now under display, let's do this image. So our drop image, and we already know that our X has to be modified, so we're going to modify it by, in this case, let's try, we can use now the width of the image. Let's go back and look at our drop. The med kit, the drop is 32 by 32. So we know that technically it's our width divided by 2, because our width and height for the drop is 16. Oh no, it's divided by the width, but we'll go 16 for now. Y minus 16. And that should have it relatively centered to where that drop is. So we'll show the drop image. So now let's run this and let's see what we get. So now we can see we have a bunch of falling medkits happening. Looks like the medkits could benefit from outline around them as well, but it gives me, and it's hard to see with that red, so I'm going to change that red to a green right now just so we can see where that drop, so we can see how that circle really doesn't correspond to the size of the artwork. So if we are going to stick with height and width at 16, that's problematic. But if I were to go 32 and 32, now let's see what happens to it. And that circle gets a little bit bigger. But notice these are not really round, so it probably isn't going to be an ideal situation where we need to kind of adjust that place on it. And we could also adjust the placement of the drop within this. So instead of going up 16, because it was 16, or so the med kit is only 22 tall. So knowing it's only 22 tall, we probably don't want to go up 16. I was thinking it was 32, but it's 32 by that. So let's go only up by 11. And now see, does this line up? So that lines up a little bit closer to it. And we could probably adjust that size of that circle a little bit to make it a little bit tighter. So if we were to say our drop isn't 32 but is maybe 28 by 28, and this is part of figuring out when we're not doing rectangles. So that circle is much tighter to it, so now we're going to get a much more consistent kind of sizing to that drop while it's falling down on the screen. So it seems that, you know, we're in pretty good shape, that things are starting to work. So what we can do is ditch the image over the top. So it's always a good idea to have that. That's kind of our debugging technique that we can use. And with the rectangle based collision, we'll draw just a transparent rectangle over our images so we get a sense of how those are showing up and working in our project. So now let's click there. So yeah, it seems that, yeah, we're able to make things work. Our drops are falling down. We're catching our drops. We can win the game. We can lose the game. Oh no, we can't lose the game yet because we haven't figured out how to do that. That's where we need our COVID image to start falling in. So we can have a way that we can lose the game. Because right now, it's the same game, but we've replaced our images, replaced our circles with images to make the whole thing a lot more interesting to play.